Our Bible word is 1 Peter 3 verse 15. But sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you, with meekness and fear. So let's first have a look at the context of 1 Peter. So 1 Peter, the epistle of 1 Peter. At the beginning we can read there, it says in verses 1, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ. So by the early church it was accepted that this was an epistle from the apostle Peter. And scholars today, some question that this was written by the apostle Peter because one reason is that the Greek is too good and a Galilean fisherman could not have written such good Greek. But that's not necessarily a good argument because Greek was widespread in ancient Palestine. It was the international language of the time, so to speak. And also, even if Peter couldn't write, because most people couldn't write back then, he could have also written this with the help of a scribe, or what is also known as an amanuensis. If we go to chapter 5, verses 12, it says, the author says here, by Silvanus, our faithful brother, as I consider him, I've written to you briefly. So, some scholars say it refers to Silvanus here being the scribe who writes the letter on behalf of Peter, or he could also be the letter carrier, in other words, the one who carried the letter to the various congregations, or perhaps he could be both. So there's debate in terms of what this exactly means. But it's not as if Peter himself would have been a foreigner to Greek, but that's one of the objections that Peter the apostle wrote this epistle. But we will approach this epistle as it comes from the apostle Peter. Because for those who say that it was not written by Peter, they dated to the 70s, 80s or 90s. If it comes from the apostle Peter, scholars date it to the early 60s. And Peter refers here to Babylon, that he was writing from Babylon, which is a code word for Rome. So if it was written by the apostle Peter, he was writing it from Rome. And perhaps here with the help of Silvanus, who acted as his secretary. In the early 60s. And we can go read there in chapter 5, verses 13. She who is in Babylon, elect together with you, greets you. And so does Mark, my son. So Peter identifies this is from Babylon, in other words, Rome. He also says Silvanus is the one to whom I send this, and also Mark. And importantly, Silvanus, also known as Silas, and Mark was also associated with the ministry of Paul. And of course, Paul ended up also being in Rome in the 60s, early 60s. Another reason that we can see this is written by Peter is that the author also writes there, I who am a fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ. So we cannot just reject that this epistle was not written by Peter. He says here, I was a witness of the suffering of Christ. Peter was writing this because it was a difficult time for these Christians. And they were harassed. They were verbally abused. They were mistreated. We find many references to this throughout the epistle. And for example, if we go to chapter 1, verses 6 to 7, it says there, in this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while, if need be, you have been grieved by various trials. Also in other places it mentions these trials. It's not as if Christians were put to death. There's no reference to Christians being put to death here. But they were verbally abused. They were harassed because of their Christian faith. Because they were immersed in this Gentile, in this pagan surroundings. We'll come to that now. Because Apostle Peter writes here to Gentiles. And if we go to chapter 4, verses 3 to 4. Peter writes there, for we have spent enough of our past lifetime in doing the will of the Gentiles, when you walked in lewdness, lusts, drunkenness, revelries, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries. In regard to these, they think it strange that you do not run with them in the same flood of dissipation, speaking evil of you. So these Christians, they've now converted to Christianity. And of course, that means you live an ethical life. And now they're different. They are strange compared to what's the norm in their surroundings. And that's why they're being harassed and victimized and spoken ill of, etc. So these Gentiles, they come to Christ. They change their lives. And of course, Peter also writes to them, before you lived in ignorance. He says this in chapter 1, verses 14. Ignorant of God, of what is good, of what is true. Also in verses 18, the author writes, knowing that you were not redeemed with corruptible things, like silver or gold, from your aimless conduct received by tradition from your fathers. So here's a reference to really the sinful, meaningless existence of Gentiles, the way they lived. But now they've been redeemed from that. They've come to know Christ. So they are suffering from locals because they've withdrawn from the culture of their context. Because they are Christians, they've now received strength to disassociate themselves from immoral behavior, from the culture of their context. And because of that, they are treated badly. People are speaking ill of them, and they are being verbally abused, etc. And Peter also refers to them as sojourners or pilgrims. And in other words, they do not belong here. Now these two words, you already find it there in verses 1, to the pilgrims. You can also say sojourner or stranger. Also in verses 17, that's mentioned, but that's not clear so in the New King James Version. But if you go to chapter 2, verses 11, it also says there, Beloved, I beg you as sojourners and pilgrims. So those two words, sojourners and pilgrims, they are basically synonyms. And they can be translated as being a stranger or a foreigner, a non-citizen or an alien, a resident alien. In other words, you're a non-citizen of that area. It can also mean you're a temporary resident. So Peter's addressing these Christians. You do not belong to this world. You are pilgrims. You are sojourners. You are elect. You have been separated now from the sinful context and norms and values from your culture that is around you. God has elected you. And so you're just pilgrims here because your true home is in heaven. So that's another interesting thing to take note of in terms of 1 Peter. 1 Peter addresses these Gentile Christians who are verbally abused, harassed. People speak badly about them because they do not want to participate anymore in sin and what's going on around them. They are pilgrims or they are strangers, aliens here. This is not their true home, their place of rest. Their place of rest is in heaven. So we are now in the second half of 1 Peter. That is how to live in a hostile world. That's from chapters 2 verse 11 to chapter 4 verse 11. And again, we must understand the context of these Christians. They were a small minority of people in the ancient world. And imagine you live in a world where everything was hostile towards you. The culture, the values, the gods, religion. Your neighbors were against you. They speak evil of you. They can't understand. Why are you following this Christ? Everything was against you. And these people, they were a small minority. And they tried to live an ethical life. They left behind their pagan life. But in their environment, there's no universal sense of morality to live decent lives. The gods didn't expect you to live moral lives. They just expected that you make sacrifices to them, or that was the belief. you must make sacrifices to them, and then they will protect you and make sure nothing bad happens to you. There was no culture of human rights, of that all people have worth and dignity. That kind of ethos that pervades culture. Nothing like that existed. And yeah, these few Christians, of course, they're new to Christianity, and now the change for them, it was a radical break from the past, from what they were used to. And now they suffer because of that, because of their commitment to Jesus. Also for us today, our situation is different. The world, especially in the West, is becoming more hostile to faith, to Christianity. There's the onslaught of secularism, there's the onslaught of scientific materialism or atheism that attacks people of Christian faith. And the word we'll come to in verse 15 is give a defense, and the Greek apologia. And this is also where the word apologetics comes from. And today in Christianity, apologetics is a burgeoning field. It's to defend your Christian faith and explain the reason why Christianity is true and why we are still Christians. But of course, making it personal for us, we also need to be competent defenders of the faith. We cannot just come to church and not grow in understanding. We ourselves are called upon. You must give a defense of why you believe in Jesus. In other words, give this apologia. Give a defense. You must be able to explain your commitment to Jesus. And if we now look at our immediate pericope, that's from chapter 3, verses 13 to 17. That is suffering for the sake of good. And 1 Peter is full of mention of these Christians suffering. It's in chapter 1, verses 6 to 7, and 2, basically every chapter. You can go read those passages. It's about Christians who are suffering. They are accused as being doers of evil. But Peter admonishes them, suffer for the right reason. Also, you are partakers of Christ's suffering. And Christ has also given us an example in suffering. If you go to chapter 2, verses 21. For to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow his steps, who committed no sin, nor was deceit found in his mouth, who, when he was reviled, did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but committed himself to him who judges righteously. So Jesus also suffered, and he was innocent. And even through his suffering, he did not respond with threats and violence or whatever. And Peter now admonishes these Christians, you do the same. Because Christ set us an example in this. Now if we go to our pericope, if we go to verses 3, verses 13, Peter speaks there. Normally, people won't do you harm if you do good. He asks a rhetorical question. Who will do you harm if you do good? But they're in a context where they actually suffer harm because they do good. So in the next verse he writes, but even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you are blessed, and do not be afraid of their threats, nor be troubled. Yeah, Peter is quoting from Isaiah, especially chapters 7 to 8. And Peter specifically alludes to Isaiah 8, verses 12 to 13. In Isaiah 7 to 8, the southern kingdom of Judah was threatened by Israel, and also the kingdom of Aram that was situated to the north of Judah, because they threatened to remove Judah's king, King Ahaz. But at this time, Isaiah promised God will protect them. So they must not be afraid of their plots. So it is, as in that time, don't be afraid of their plots and their threats. Peter admonishes these Christians also, don't be scared of their plots and whatever threats they aim at you. So why must they not be afraid? Or how can they respond to these threats? We come to our Bible word. But sanctify the Lord God in your hearts. Now take note, the King James Version of the Bible is based on some later manuscripts, the earliest manuscripts that has been discovered since the time of when the original King James Version was put together. It actually has a different reading here. It actually refers to Christ. So if we can look at that text again, the earliest manuscripts read, "But sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts. And always be ready to give a defense." In other words, that apologia in the Greek. Always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you with meekness and fear. So he's encouraging these Christians, you must know why you are followers of Jesus. Sanctify Christ as Lord. In other words, He's the one who controls your life. He's your Lord. You devoted to the Lord. You trust the Lord. Irrespective of the circumstances, sanctify. In other words, make Jesus holy as your Lord, as the one to whom you are devoted, faithful. You will always retain your trust in the Lord. That is how we sanctify Jesus in our hearts. And be ready to give a defense. Be competent. Have knowledge of your faith. Why do you have this faith and commitment to Jesus? But also, don't be arrogant about it. As it says, do it with meekness and fear. Also, the next verse says you must do this with a clear conscience. You cannot do wrong and evil and give defense on behalf of Jesus. What's the point? Also, then, if you suffer, you suffer for the wrong reason. Speak about Jesus, defend your faith about Jesus, but with a clear conscience. As he says in verse 17, "For it is better, if it is the will of God, to suffer for doing good than for doing evil." And then Peter then also follows this by explaining Jesus himself suffered for the sake of good. He was our example in how to suffer. And after our immediate pericope, Peter explains, like we must suffer for good, Jesus also suffered for good, the just for the unjust. Through that we obtain the forgiveness of sins. So Peter admonished them here, become good apologists. In other words, become people who can defend your Christian faith. No matter who attacks you, you have knowledge, you have understanding, you are capable to defend your faith and your trust towards Jesus. Because that word defend comes from the Greek word apologia. So become good apologists for your Christian faith.